Okay, welcome back. This is the continuation of the January 4, 2021 Vermont Climate Council meeting after a break. The next, we do have a quorum present, having taken a roll call, so we can move on to the next item on our agenda, which is the 10:45 a.m. item, which is climate mitigation, adaptation, and resilience on natural working lands. And we have Dr. Alexandra Casaba, whose name I probably have not pronounced correctly, who is our climate forester from the Department of Forest, Parks and Recreation, and Ryan Patch, who's the Deputy Director of Water Quality at the Agency of Agriculture. So I will turn the floor over to them, ask them to introduce themselves briefly and take it away.
Okay, let me just share my screen here. Is that presentation viewable to folks? Yes, great. Is. All right, well, thank you for having me. Thanks for the introduction. Yes, it's Alexandra Casaba, hard one to pronounce. I don't take offense to it. Yes, I am the climate forester for the Department of Forest, Parks and Recreation, the Agency of Natural Resources. And I'm joined in this presentation by Ryan Patch, who I passed the presentation to in a bit, from the Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets. So this presentation is really intended to provide the Council with a pretty broad overview of the importance and role of Vermont's natural and working lands in a changing climate, and recognizing that the subcommittee that will focus on this topic will have a chance to dive deeper into these details. So I'll introduce some terms and concepts that help you navigate this information, explain the carbon cycle, discuss forest carbon storage and fluxes, and touch on strategies that we can use to harness the power of our forests. I will introduce the importance of wetlands briefly and then pass the torch to Ryan to discuss agriculture. So natural and working lands in Vermont are farmlands, our forest lands, grass and shrublands, and wetlands. So they cover 94% of our state, which is quite significant. And they are key players in climate change mitigation and adaptation. So they can mitigate climate change by capturing atmospheric carbon dioxide. And for this reason, they've been termed recently natural climate solutions. You may have heard that phrase bouncing around. But natural and working lands are currently and will continue to be affected by climate change. So these effects not only impact the ecosystems themselves, but will impact our communities and our economy. And so to moderate these impacts, we will require strategies to promote the resilience of these systems. And climate change really could threaten the vital ecosystem services that our natural and working lands provide, from preventing soil erosion, cycling water, providing sustainable local food, wood, energy products. These contribute greatly to our economy, assuring opportunities for tourism, recreation, and really, defining our identity here in Vermont. But to maintain these services that forests and other natural and working lands provide, we must keep them both functioning and intact. So forests and other plant-based ecosystems can capture and store carbon dioxide from the air. But it's really important to recognize that carbon dioxide is not static in these systems. And so I'm going to illustrate kind of the basic forest carbon cycle and recognize that this is a schematic and simplification. So the main way that carbon dioxide from the atmosphere enters the forest or other natural and working land is through plants. So it enters through leaves, pores in the leaf, and the plant then transforms this carbon dioxide through photosynthesis into carbohydrates. This process emits oxygen back into the atmosphere. So the tree uses some of this carbon and carbohydrates for energy, just as you and I do, every living organism does, needs energy sources. But and this process does then emit carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. But the main, most of the carbon that the tree is taking in via photosynthesis is to build new parts and grow larger and make fruit and roots and branches and all the parts of a plant ecosystem that are needed. And at this point, there are actually many pathways for the carbon to follow in this system. So what can happen is tree parts or the entire tree can die, right? Leaves are shed in the fall, they fall to the forest floor. And these parts are then decomposed by fungi, insects, all sorts of microorganisms that we have in our forests and our natural working lands. And that releases, again, some CO2 back into the atmosphere. And while some of this carbon gets transferred into those organisms, they need to build bigger bodies and grow. Some of it makes its way into the soil, where it can have, again, a number of different fates depending on our conditions. So it can be emitted back out into the atmosphere in soil microbial processes that happen in the soil. It can be leached into waterways naturally from rainfall events. And it can bind into soil particles and really be stored in our soil for various amounts of time, but upwards of centuries or millennia. There are also other pathways for the carbon in this living biomass to follow. So that tree or that plant in an agricultural system could be harvested, or there could be some sort of natural disturbance that either damages or kills the plant or the tree. And these events will cycle some of that plant matter back into the forest and gets decomposed by those organisms and transferred into the soil, same sort of pathway. And some of this gets released as carbon dioxide, again, it gets emitted. And really the difference here is in these different types of disturbance events, a fire or insect defoliation or timber harvest is really the proportion that gets cycled back into the forest and versus emitted, and the rate at which that gets emitted back to the atmosphere. So something like a fire is a really immediate release of carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere versus a timber harvest that produces harvests and makes durable wood products can result in a slower emission of that carbon in the wood. So carbon storage in plant-based ecosystems, and really forests in particular, is vital for the global carbon cycle. So in fact, half of the dry weight of wood is carbon that was removed from the atmosphere by that growing tree. It's a pretty impressive amount of carbon. And one thing, just to clarify some terminology, although plants break apart this CO2 molecule in photosynthesis, the carbon does rejoin oxygen when it is emitted, whatever route it takes to be emitted back into the atmosphere. So it's easier and simpler for us to convert carbon in a forest ecosystem or a wetland or an agriculture ecosystem to the carbon dioxide equivalent. It helps us compare amongst those systems, but also with other sources of greenhouse gases like anthropogenic sources. One interesting thing to illustrate the importance of forests and trees in particular is the equivalent carbon dioxide in wood is more than its actual weight. So if you have a metric ton of dry wood, you have half a metric ton of carbon, right? So it's 50% carbon by weight, more or less. But the CO2 equivalent is actually 1.8 metric tons of carbon dioxide taken out of the atmosphere, because a carbon dioxide molecule is heavier than the single carbon atom by about 3.7 times. So it's an interesting fact about wood, makes it very powerful in storing atmospheric carbon. A couple other terms, these were introduced in the last Climate Council meeting. Just want to reiterate them here for everyone to be on the same page. Carbon sequestration, process of removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, storing it in another form that cannot immediately be released, so like wood or soils. Carbon sequestration is expressed as a negative value per unit time, and we typically use metric tons of CO2 equivalent in something like a year, so a rate. And the opposite of carbon sequestration are carbon emissions. As I described already in the previous slides, there are many sources of carbon emissions in natural and working lands and forests. And this is expressed as a positive value per unit time. So the balance between these two, between carbon sequestration, carbon emissions, is what we call net flux. So think of this as just the rate of change in the amount of stored carbon, where carbon storage is the carbon stored, the amount of carbon in some sort of entity. So in a tree, in an acre of forest, in a wetland. But forests and other natural working lands can be what we call carbon sinks, or they can be carbon sources, depending on this balance between sequestration and emissions. So for example, carbon sink, if the net flux negative number is less than 0, that means that that system, that forest, sequestered more in that time frame than it emitted. And the total carbon storage will thus increase. If the net flux is a negative value, forest emitted more carbon dioxide than it sequestered in that amount of time. For example, and that's a net carbon source, we call it. And this can occur in this example of a fire here, which I described previously as a really big emitter of stored carbon in a forest system. But it can happen in land clearing, or if the trees have poor health, they weren't able to sequester as much carbon because they're injured by insects, disease, weather events, drought. So in forests and other natural working lands, we can describe carbon storage and flux overall for the entire forest, but we can also look at it by these components, which we call carbon pools. So each of these carbon pools has a different flux rate, so a different rate that new carbon is added to that pool and carbon is emitted back to the atmosphere. So for example, as I've described, the above ground biomass, live trees and shrubs, really active, dynamic carbon cycling, versus soils. It takes a while for soils, takes longer for new carbon to enter the soil carbon pool. But when there is an opportunity for that carbon to be stored for long periods of time. And you can see each of these pools has a different storage amount in our forests here in Vermont. This is the Vermont's forest carbon storage across all of our forests. So that's the total proportion of carbon in each of these carbon pools. And you can see that forest soils really dominate this carbon in our forests. More than half of the carbon is located in our soils. And it's actually almost half or almost 2 times the amount of what we can see in our above ground live biomass. So in managed forests, we also have additional carbon pools in the harvested wood products. And this occurs both when those products are in use. So think of lumber used to build in construction, to build homes and other buildings, furniture, hardwood flooring, etc. But also when the products are in landfill, both these long used products, like I just mentioned, or even shorter lived products like paper and cardboard, when those are in landfill or in processing, they do store some amount of carbon while they slowly decompose. So currently, in terms of carbon storage, our forests store over 1.7 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. That's here. And if you add the amount in harvested wood products, both in use and in landfill, we get about 1.9 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent in storage. So to put this into context, if somehow we lost all of our forests and all of our wood product carbon storage, that would be equivalent to about 200 times our current annual state emissions. So it's a really large amount of carbon. But however, great large pool of carbon storage, atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration is really affected by changes in the size of the carbon pool rather than the carbon pool itself. So each year, our forests add an additional 5 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. That varies from year to year. And our harvested wood products, this add about 250,000 metric tons in additional carbon storage each year. Again, varies from year to year. So this means our forests and harvested wood products are what we would call a net carbon sink. They're accruing carbon every year for what we have data for. But we need to keep in mind that with climate change, with the stress of climate change, with forest conversion, so loss of forests, this is not a guaranteed pool. So not only can harvested wood products store carbon, perhaps a more important or interesting role they can have in emissions reduction is to act as a substitute for other high emissions products. So example of this is sawn wood. When we use sawn wood in buildings, like especially commercial buildings, like this is an example on the left of a wood parking garage, which is really interesting. There's less carbon dioxide equivalent emitted compared to using steel and concrete in that building. So this is because steel and concrete have really high emissions from a combination of extraction, manufacture, and transportation compared to using local wood products. When we use wood products for bioenergy instead of fossil fuels, we also avoid some emissions that comes from the extraction, processing, transportation of those fuels. And you can see here that there is a range for these substitution benefits. It's pretty complex to compute and really depends on a lot of local factors like distance, transportation distances, and whatnot. So, and in addition to the substitution benefits, durable wood products also have an addition carbon storage pool, remember. So for the life of that product use, that carbon is essentially locked up in that product. So when we look at carbon fluxes from the forest sector, we need to consider not just the forest, harvested wood products, as I've mentioned, but also trees that we have in our cities and towns, on roadways, and the amount and rate of forest loss or gain through land use conversion. So when we look at the sources for the forest sector, we see that there are both carbon sources and sinks. So these, I'm showing data for here, the carbon forest sector for 2018. It's the most recent year of data we have for carbon flux from the forest sector. And note that these forest sector values are not included in the state greenhouse gas inventory, as was described in the last Climate Council meeting. So these are really just to showcase the power of the forest sector and provide some opportunities. So to orient you to this graph, on the y-axis on the bottom, we have net carbon flux. So in 2018, million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And values to the left of the zero line is carbon sequestration. So that means carbon uptake. And to the right of the zero line, carbon emissions, carbon release. So starting from the bottom, the big dark green bar are our forests. They sequestered over 5 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent in 2018. And that accounts for, that is the net accounting for any harvest or disturbance, etc. So those forests that have remained as forests. Municipal trees, our trees in our towns and our cities, sequestered about 500,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent in 2018. Land use change is a mix, as you can see. So we have some activities that sequestered carbon, so land converted to forests, but land converted from forests were net emitters. And it's important to note here that converted forest land, especially converted to a non-plant ecosystem, means not only emissions of the stored carbon, but it means loss of future carbon sequestration from that land. Looking at harvested wood products, we have emissions about a little over 2 million metric tons. And this includes combustion from bioenergy, which was shown in the Climate Council meeting covering the greenhouse gas inventory, but it also includes the decomposition of those products in landfills. So there's a slow decomposition that happens that emits greenhouse gases. And we also have about 1.5 million metric tons of sequestration in substitution benefits. So when we simplify this figure, here we combine forests and trees at the bottom bar, And we have 5.7 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. We combine land use. So the net emissions from those 4 land use categories is positive 1 million metric tons. Combining substitution and emissions from harvested wood products, positive 0.6. And so just to put this in comparison, like I said, we do not include these values in our state level greenhouse gas inventory. But to put this in context of our total state emissions, and this is for 2018, so that's an estimated value, if you remember from the last presentation, we have a net of about 4.9 million metric tons. So in other words, if you combine the forest sector together, it's about 45% of our state annual emissions that it has potential to compensate for. I show these data to the council really to illustrate the power of our forests to sequester atmospheric carbon dioxide and the many opportunities we have, the many factors that contribute to the carbon budget that do present opportunities to maintain or even increase the mitigation potential of our forests. So first, we can manage our forests for increased carbon sequestration through good forest stewardship and ecological silviculture that can increase live tree growth rates and increase the carbon in our dead wood pool, which then can cycle to our soils. Our town and city trees also require good stewardship to maintain their health and productivity, but we could achieve increased carbon capture by additional tree planting. In terms of land use, we have an opportunity to reduce carbon emissions through thoughtful land use planning. And remember, again, that loss of forest land is not only emissions of the stored carbon, but loss of future carbon sequestration. So each acre we lose sort of chips away at that forest carbon sink. We also have an opportunity to decrease harvested wood products emission and increase carbon storage by increasing the amount of wood products that can replace other products that can be durable. And managing our forests sustainably with principles of ecological silviculture can really, supports our local economy, provides local control of our energy and building products, and can really, we need to be mindful that can reduce unintended impacts of using other products that in places where we can't ensure the care for the environment or human rights. So there are challenges, even though there are opportunities, there are a lot of challenges to consider if we want to use the forest sector to help meet Vermont's emissions reduction goals. So to offset emissions with forest carbon sequestration, we need to be able to measure these carbon fluxes accurately. And that is incredibly difficult because of the highly variable nature of our forests and the quick turnaround time of carbon in our forests. It also requires quite a lot of data to produce these reasonable estimates. We do have remote sensing, so those are satellite technologies and other sensors for doing some of this work that are really developing and show a lot of promise. The second challenge is the composition of forest ownership. Jens really talked great about the local control that we have in a lot of this decision making, but also the local control on our forests. 80% of Vermont forest land is privately owned. So this just poses some complexities when we think about coordinated management. A third issue is that we need to be careful not to double count forest carbon. I know this might seem like a weird concept, but this is really a growing issue because there are new markets in which a landowner can sell forest carbon to companies that will offset their emissions using that additional carbon sequestration. So these are called carbon offset markets, carbon credit markets. In Vermont, about 20,000 acres of forest land has already been enrolled in a carbon offset market, and this amount is really growing steadily. So this means that much of the stored carbon as well as the future carbon sequestration of that forest has already been sold to another entity and cannot be counted to Vermont's greenhouse gas emissions reductions. Another thing we need to be consider is that if we want to account for forest carbon, we also need to account for carbon fluxes from other natural and working lands, for which we have comparably less data than we do for forests. And lastly, when it comes to climate change mitigation using natural and working lands, there is a difference between increasing carbon sequestration and avoiding carbon emissions. And I'll illustrate this. So it is important to recognize the difference between these two types of mitigation strategies, especially in terms of the state's emissions reduction targets and what we include in the greenhouse gas inventory. So first, there are strategies to enhance the carbon sink, right? So this is increasing carbon storage of Vermont's forests. So example are planting more trees, using ecological silviculture to enhance live tree growth. But we also have opportunities, strategies to reduce the source of carbon released and emitted back into the atmosphere. So things like avoiding deforestation or substituting wood products for higher emissions products. And these strategies are incredibly important, but they can be more difficult to quantify because they often are theoretical, right? So you don't actually have the emissions, but you have to calculate how much you saved in emissions. So while mitigation strategies aim to reduce emissions or enhance natural systems to sequester and store carbon, we also need to consider adaptation strategies that aim to reduce vulnerabilities and advance the resilience of our natural systems. So really the ideal strategies fall right in the middle. They achieve both mitigation and adaptation in what have been called joint mitigation adaptation strategies, or JMAs. You may see the abbreviation. And so when we look at we have some great strategies already for mitigation and adaptation, but really when we look at them, we can recognize that done in a certain way and considered in a certain light, they can achieve both mitigation and adaptation. So for example, when we have avoid deforestation or reforestation, afforestation, tree planting, both of these activities really are preserve forests as forests, which maintains pathways for community and forest resilience and preserves those ecosystem services. So example, avoiding deforestation helps to maintain landscape connectivity that Jens really illustrated well earlier. This allows species to migrate, rearrange, adapt to a changing climate. Planting new trees, yes, it's great for carbon sequestration, but also has the benefit of cooling our towns and cities, intercepting pollution, and boosting human health. So it is possible, if we don't consider these joint mitigation adaptation strategies, for mitigation strategies to have a negative adaptation consequence. So an example of this would be if we are really just want carbon sequestration and we decide to plant our forests, our intact complex forests, as tree plantations. And thus we really sacrifice some of the key ecosystem services that a complex forest provides versus a plantation. You can see this also happening if we take prime agricultural land providing great food services to us and convert it to a forest, thus losing that ability to have local food source. Well, I did say I would touch briefly on wetlands because I do think they're really important. And while they only cover about 5% of our state, more or less, they really do have some unique and important characteristics like water filtration and flood mitigation that will be increasingly critical in a changing climate. And because the soils have really low decomposition rates, soils and wetlands can store anywhere from 2 to 3 times the carbon that a forest soil can store. So we do really lack comprehensive data on these carbon fluxes in wetlands. So that's something we recognize is a gap in our understanding. In terms of joint mitigation adaptation strategies, we have really protecting wetlands, minimizing disturbance to wetlands, and restoring wetlands are really key strategies we can use. And so we do have, as Jens pointed out, we have a lot of wetland specialists here at the state of Vermont that will kind of go into this in more detail in the subcommittee, but just to outline the really importance of these small but mighty wetlands. Now I'm going to pass the presentation to Ryan, and he can talk about agriculture.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Kasiba. Can you hear me?
Yes. Ryan, do
Yeah.
you want me to click forward for you, or do you want to share your screen?
Oh, if you would be able to, that might be the easiest to ensure a seamless transition between the presentations, if that's all right.
I can do that, yes.
Great, thank you. All right, well, good morning, everyone. My name is Ryan Patch, work for the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets in the Water Quality Division. And today I'll be sharing a brief primer on climate mitigation, adaptation, and resilience strategies in agriculture. Agriculture, of course, being a part of Vermont's working lands. As was described regarding the agriculture and working lands in Dr. Kasiba's presentation, agriculture can affect and is affected by climate change. There exists, strategies for adaptation and building resilience within the agricultural system. And as I'll try to touch on in this presentation, many of those strategies that farmers in Vermont are looking to explore and adopt also provide a mitigation benefit. The focus of this is in agricultural soils and looking at the opportunity that agricultural soils have to store carbon. In thinking about this process, a term that's been used also in presentations today, is co-benefits. And what are the positive benefits related to the reduction of greenhouse gases, for which there exists opportunities to maintain a robust agricultural landscape while providing additional mitigation strategies. When we move on to the next slide, what we will see is agriculture, as Dr. Kasiba shared, covers about 12% of Vermont's terrestrial land. The three large counties for farming include Addison, Franklin, and Orleans counties, with a concentration in the Champlain Valley. That being said, there is agriculture in every county, and there have been significant land use changes since the 1800s, where Vermont used to be 70% open. We're now looking at 73% of Vermont being forested and 12% now in agriculture. When we move on to the next slide, what we'll see, one part of the Global Warming Solutions Act is the 1990 benchmark, and so I just wanted to share how the agricultural sector may have transitioned or changed land use during that time. 1987 is the closest marker in the USDA agricultural census, which is conducted every 5 years. And since 1987, Vermont has experienced a 32% loss in agricultural cropland. This translates to about 228,000 acres of cropland no longer being managed as farm or in agriculture. When we think about how that land is managed and who it's managed by, as far as a breakdown of different sectors within agriculture, we find that 80% of farmland in Vermont is managed by dairy. That dairy industry generates 70% of the farm gate receipts. That being said, while dairy manages 80% of the open land, there are over 6,000 other farms in Vermont managing a whole host of important crops, vegetables, maple, tree fruits, nursery, hemp, as just some of the examples there. When we move to the next slide and looking at a breakdown of how land is managed in Vermont, we find there's a balance of cropland and pasture land, which equals the 37 and 10% of 10% permanent pasture, 30% of the harvested cropland in the state, balanced against 47% of the total woodland that farms report managing based on the ag census. So this is an important consideration when thinking about a farm. It's not just the barn and the animals, the crops that are being grown, but it could be the woodlot and also sugar maples as an example that may be managed by farms. When we look within the total harvested cropland for a breakdown of how, what crops are grown in the state, and we find 74% of the 400 or so thousand acres of harvested cropland are used in the management of permanent hay or other permanent sod crops, alfalfa, et cetera. 20%, about 90,000 acres in corn, small percentage in soybeans, and then a larger percentage in all the other crops that are grown, vegetables, tree and fruit nuts, nurseries, et cetera. So, Vermont farms are diverse. That's bulk of the land is in a permanent sod of one type or another, and a large amount of woodland as well. Moving now to the next slide, brief review of the emissions profile for agriculture. 12% of Vermont's emissions comes from the agricultural sector, and we'll be looking on the left side of the graph here, focusing on the manure management, enteric fermentation, agricultural soil management, as well as the fertilization and liming activities that a farm undertakes. Embedded in that emissions profile from the state is a mature technology that is deployed on a number of farms in the state. The anaerobic digestion, the ability of using that stored manure and waste, turning into biogas, flaring it, transforming it from methane to CO2, and creating heat and potentially power that can be fed back to the grid. And so this is an example of a technological solution that is deployed on several dairy farms throughout the state that helps address some of that emission side. And a large focus of what this brief presentation is going to attempt to highlight is the opportunities for mitigation, focusing on the cropland that farms manage and the opportunity to build soil carbon. As Dr. Kasiba shared, much like the forest carbon cycle, there is a soil carbon cycle that happens in agricultural cropland. And while the biomass is not harvested on a 75 or 100-year cycle for forests, farmers are managing cropland and harvesting hay or corn either many times a year or once a year. And so the largest capacity for the opportunity for that carbon to be stored exists within the soils. Strategies that farmers can adopt to enhance this include cover cropping and conservation, reduced tillage, thus reducing the amount of inversion that happens within the soil and the respiration of nitrous oxide and other the losses that happen from the burning up of that soil carbon. As mentioned, land use conversion can go both ways, both afforestation and the planting of marginal farmland into either wetland easements or riparian forest buffers, or no longer using that land for agriculture. Also taking forest land and going to agricultural cropland can have a negative influence on emissions. So moving to take a look at soil carbon on the next slide, what we see here is the concept that soil is not just an inert media in which you add nutrients and grow a crop. It's actually a living soil food web, and the concept is growing in through a number of national campaigns and state farmer focus, that farmers are managing living crops both above and below the ground, and feeding that soil food web is an important part of building organic matter that provides for the opportunities for resilience and adaptation with the ever-changing climate. The center of your, you'll see a nice cross-section of a growing plant and the just complex root systems that exist and the associations that can occur along that root structure for bacteria, fungi, mycorrhizal fungi, nematodes, just the ability for soil biology to interface here and break down organic matter that is either added to the field through a number of different strategies that we'll address, manures, cover crops, et cetera, as well as the detritus of the crop that's not harvested and left behind. This process of active soil biology is what transforms the newly dropped or decomposing biomass and transforms it into a stable carbon source, where if the land is not tilled, it can remain in the soil for a significant period of time. When we move on to the next slide, what we will find is the focus of the National USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service has been focused on a campaign around soil health, which helps introduce a number of concepts which translate to practices which farmers are adopting at ever increasing rates nationally, but especially in Vermont, which focuses on nurturing that food web and the ability of soils to generate organic matter and turn into healthy soils. When we move on to the next slide, we'll begin to get into some examples of the conservation practices that help improve soil structure and begin to build some of the healthy soils and the soil health, which is such a focus of the approach that farmers have to managing their cropland. So rotating crops as much as possible, providing a cover crop, which has really been adopted in a significant way by farmers throughout the state, reducing tillage, which minimizes the inversion of soil, allows those soil bacteria and other bugs and other important biological activity to occur undisturbed. Disturbing the soil as little as possible it interrupts their ability to do the breakdown and mineralize those nutrients that are needed for healthy soil profile. Moving on to the next slide, just a continuation of some of these practices, mulch tillage, mulching, and then of course nutrient management, the timing and placement of nutrients on the crop field, which can reduce volatilization, make it more bioavailable, and reintroduce as part of that web the biomass that's harvested, fed to a cow, gets stored or dropped directly on the pasture in the form of grazing, or reapplied when manure is spread in the spring, summer, or fall. So an important closure to the cycle there. We move on to the next slide. I'll share a link in the chat for a 1-minute video, which I would encourage everyone to take a look at. It is it will elucidate more than I could share in the time we have today about why organic matter is so important, why a healthy, well-aggregated soil provides many of the benefits that we're looking for a resilient system that can enable farms to adapt to the changes in floods and drought that we're even seeing in Vermont. Alternating years of disaster drought declarations to some of the rainiest seasons that we've seen to another drought this year is what Vermont farmers are dealing with. And the ability for soils to build organic matter is an important part of the opportunities to provide that adaptation and resilience. The graphic there on the left shares the point that every 1% of increase in organic matter can increase the ability of that soil to hold 25,000 gallons of water. That's close to 1 inch of rainfall. And the ability to have this well-aggregated, high organic matter soil enables water that hits the surface of the field to infiltrate, be stored in the spaces in the soil pores from a well-aggregated soil, prevent runoff, and of course is the organic matter and the carbon equivalents that could be stored in the soils. Moving on to the next slide, what we'll see here is the rate of adoption of these practices that farmers in the state of Vermont are undertaking. This work is being driven in large part by the water quality challenges found in the state with regards to Lake Champlain, for Magog, River, and the focus on reducing phosphorus and nitrogen losses from agricultural crop fields. And so when we talk about the co-benefits of managing for greenhouse gas sequestration, the state of Vermont has been approaching this first from a water quality perspective. And what we have here is a graph of state-funded adoption and implementation of conservation practices by farmers throughout the state. You can look at the highlighted conservation practices there and pull out some of the important ones. Cover crop as an example, close to 20,000 acres just from the state. When you take in the federal support for that program, we're up over 30,000 acres of cover crop, which is over a third of the corn in the state of Vermont being in cover crop from the fall through the spring. And what underpins this state accounting and financial assistance is a protocol for quantifying estimated phosphorus reductions from the adoption of these technologies. What is not present at this time is a protocol or process for estimating how much additional carbon may be sequestered from the adoption of this practice. So this and what the balance of that is against the emissions of that soil and the supporting practices that a farm may adopt to grow food or crops across their entire farm. But there exists this robust focus on water quality funded by Clean Water Fund, for which farmers in the state have really come forward and begin to adopt a number of these important practices that also have this co-benefit of improving resilience and providing adaptation opportunities through healthier soils, and there exists a potential to attempt to quantify some of the mitigation efforts from greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. Moving on to the next slide. Part and parcel to this agricultural water quality work that the Agency of Agriculture undertakes is conversations at the legislative level around defining what regenerative farming means for Vermont, what healthy soils mean for Vermont, and throughout the development and adoption of water quality programming and a focus on improving water quality, it cannot be understated that the recognition and understanding that one of the ways to achieve those ends is focusing on healthy soils and promoting that through a number of different ways, not just technical assistance, but also funding for the adoption of cover crop, et cetera, through financial assistance programming. Moving on to the next slide. One important area of work where this is really being moved forward is through the Payment for Ecosystem Services Working Group. Dr. Kasiba introduced that wheel of ecosystem services, and we're all very aware of some of the provisioning services from agricultural land, food and fiber as an example. But as has been described throughout this presentation, there are a number of other ecosystem services that can be delivered to the state through the management of healthy soils. What the working group is termed, focusing on investing in Vermont's natural capital, which are the agricultural soils which have the ability to provide both the water quality benefit, the carbon sequestration benefit, as well as watershed resilience through both good floodplain management, as well as the increase in organic matter, which can help manage the increased precipitation that the state is seeing. So when this work is ongoing, it's chaired by the Agency of Ag and has a number of different members from both agriculture, research universities, et cetera. But the large focus of the group is focusing on trying to quantify and make legible the benefits that are currently and could be expanded to be delivered to the state and downstream neighbors from a farm. Many of the ecosystems that is not fully quantified or understood. This is a body of work that is ongoing and is something that is being led by farmer groups in the state. So there's some real momentum here to leverage and further accelerate the rate of adoption of a number of these practices that improve water quality, but also focusing and thinking about soils as a bank of natural capital that can be invested in depending on how a farmer manages their cropland. So in review, as we move into the next summary, there exists mitigation strategies for each of the sources of emission as quantified in the DEC emissions inventory. For both the enteric fermentation side, the manure management from both how manure is applied to the ground, whether it's injected into soils, or the adoption of covers on waste storage facilities or anaerobic digestion facilities. And then, of course, the largest focus of this presentation has been on example mitigation strategies for agricultural cropland and the opportunity that exists to either keep soil or carbon in the ground through the avoidance or reduction of tillage practices, as well as the adoption of other practices which support improvements of soil health around cover crop and crop rotation. So finally, in summary, conservation practices can influence soil carbon levels. The amount is not fully realized at this time. There exist technologies that can and have been adopted on farms. And when we think about a farm in Vermont, there's many more parts than just the cropland that they're managing. Forest lands are a large part of the balance sheet of what farms manage. And there exists significant movement for the quantification of the potential benefits for the storage of carbon in agricultural soils through a number of national projects and programs that look to quantify and pay for verified improvements in soil carbon storage in soils. So thank you for the opportunity to share a brief overview, and I'll pass it back to Dr. Kasiba. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Ryan. Yes, just to kind of summarize very key points here from a lot of information we presented. So Vermont's natural and working lands can help us mitigate climate change, but we also have to recognize that they are impacted by climate change. So getting that balance right will be key. Currently, our forest sector provides a substantial carbon benefit, but again, this is not guaranteed with impacts from climate change on forest health, loss of forest land. We need to be mindful of their resilience moving forward. In terms of agricultural systems, really some key areas for opportunities are increasing organic matter content of those soils that provide many benefits in addition to the carbon benefit. But to account for these carbon sinks, one key thing we need are data. So we need to be able to measure it and quantify it. That helps us manage it better. And there are great opportunities we have for both mitigation and adaptation strategies to be together in joint mitigation adaptation strategies. And those can increase the resilience of our natural built systems, which then effectively increases the resilience of our communities, our economy, and the state of Vermont. So that's what we have. Very, very rapid overview of these topics that, again, will be gone into more detail in those subcommittees. But hopefully we have some time for questions and discussion.
We do have some time for questions, Dr. Kasiba. Thank you. And thank you, Ryan. Melissa, would you do the honors, please?
Certainly. Member Flynn, please. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Kasiba. This is a very interesting presentation, as they all are this morning. I had a question and I think a comment. The comment first, when you were mentioning double counting, when you were talking about carbon sequestration, I believe, and offsets, was that framed the way I would picture that? A stand of trees is already storing carbon. So if an entity wants to buy offsets, it's not like you can park more carbon there because they're already storing carbon. So is that what you were referring to when you were talking about awareness of how we count offsets? Because forest land, as we speak, is already storing something, whether someone has purchased acres of it as offset or not. That's the comment. And then the question had to do with when you were talking about forest soils and carbon storage. I'm curious, is that calculated at a particular depth of soil? And the reason I ask is if soils are deeper, are we storing more carbon? I'm just curious. Thank you very much.
Yeah, great question. So the first one about the forest carbon offset market. So there's multiple parts of that. Yes, on an acre of forest, that acre is storing and then naturally sequestering carbon, but those rates of carbon sequestration vary by the age of the forest, by disturbances that happen to that forest, including timber harvest, but also natural disturbances, or like a summer we had this past summer. It was very droughty, and likely our trees did not grow as well, and probably next year will not grow as well as they normally would. So you can do things using silviculture to increase the carbon sequestration of that forest and therefore the carbon storage. And so forest carbon offset markets do that. They attempt to increase carbon storage of the forest based compared to some sort of baseline or business as usual calculation. So basically you have to show in that project that you are storing carbon additional to what would be stored without that project. So it's a little bit of a tricky thing to get with, but if we're talking about Vermont's carbon storage of all of our forests, we just need to be aware if we're saying I presented those values of all of our Vermont's forests, but recognizing I didn't subtract out those 20,000 acres that are already sold essentially in a carbon offset market. So as more and more acres are enrolled and that carbon is essentially sold, we can't then compare that to our state level greenhouse gas inventories. We'll need to be careful about that. So it's just a little thing right now. It's not a huge amount. It really doesn't make a big impact, but it could in the future. And there might be opportunities for us to think about that as a state, how we want to approach carbon offset markets in a maybe more systematic way. As far as soil carbon, I'm not a soil scientist, but yes, it does depend on depth, certainly. And there's actually been some discrepancies in soil carbon in forests based on that. So there were, it used to be there was just about 10 centimeters was measured, and now new estimates, including the one I used, are 30 centimeter estimates. And they found actually the thought was a lot of that carbon was in the top level, that organic kind of richer level of the soil, but really that carbon can move deeper. Some interesting work from UVM folks, Don Ross shows actually earthworms are cycling that carbon into different depths into the soil that was previously not well understood. So there's a lot of dynamics here when we talk about forest carbon and soil carbon in particular.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have two other members with their hands raised. We'll start with Sue Minter, please.
Thanks. My question was also about the forest carbon offset market. You mentioned 20,000 acres sold. Where is this market? Is this a private market, or and are we actively enrolled as a state, and is this a potential revenue generator? Recognizing that offsets are not necessarily equitable, given our last conversation.
Yes, that's a good point. So I can share with the council, there was a Vermont carbon sequestration working group chaired by Commissioner Snyder that released a report, I think about this time last year. So they were charged with looking at forest carbon sequestration opportunities in the state. Yes, there are folks that are enrolling land, so private landowners, nonprofit groups are doing this. And it is something that is a source of revenue. So essentially, as I described, there's you need to accrue carbon in that forest above some baseline or business as usual calculation. And so entities will buy those credits, which is essentially, it's, we're talking about metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. That is one credit, is 1 metric ton. And so you can sell those on this market. They are what I mostly will be opportunities for Vermonters, what we call the voluntary carbon market. And that is compared to a regulatory or compliance market. So that's regulatory compliance markets are set up by governments. Example is California's cap and trade program. So that's kind of a good example of that. And that's where entities are given credits to trade based on emissions, and it's really attempts to lower state level emissions, giving those businesses an opportunity to buy credits if they can't lower their emissions in the amount of time required. Because sometimes there's unavoidable emissions or technological advances that are needed, or time or money to lower those emissions. So it's a way to kind of give a stopgap to those entities. What the California cap and trade system is really at its capacity for projects, particularly outside of California and the surrounding states. So really the pathway right now until new markets are developed is what we call the voluntary market. And that's just you and I, any entity can buy a carbon offset on there to offset our emissions, right? So an airline could do it, an individual could buy a carbon offset. And we do have projects here in Vermont as well as elsewhere in New England. And they tend to be large projects. Right now, that's really how it's feasible. Are couple thousand acre projects, but there are new pathways that are going to be being developed, like by the Nature Conservancy, for smaller family forest owners to get some revenue from securing carbon on their property and sequestering additional. And then what's really great about these is they have often long-term contracts, 40 years, 100 years. So that really does preserve that forest as forest. So there's lots of co-benefits that come along with forest carbon, even though the focus is on carbon. You preserve everything else that forest provides. So that give a very brief overview of use too. I will post the link to the carbon sequestration report, which is pretty comprehensive.
Great, thank you. And the last hand raised is by Member Duvall, please.
Thank you, and thank you both, Dr. Kasiba and Ryan, for those great presentations. My first question was for you, Dr. Kasiba, if you can speak to just looking over time at the amount of forest carbon sequestration in Vermont, going from about 5.8 million metric tons in 1990 to about 5 million metric tons as of the latest estimate in the last statewide greenhouse gas inventory. Can you speak to the primary reasons for that decline in forest carbon sequestration?
Yeah, it's not quite totally well known. So first of all, is in that same amount of time from 1990, we have also lost forest land. So as we chip away at that entity that is our forests, we lose that future sequestration. So, we're not losing a huge amount of forest land in our state converted to other uses, but every year, if we lose, estimates are anywhere from 1,000 to 4,000 acres a year of forest land that we lose, and that varies. Obviously, it's actually surprisingly hard to estimate that really accurately. But so if you look over that time frame and you get the cumulative loss of forest land, that really is a big impact that chips away at that sink. There's also speculation that our kind of similarly aged forests and aging forests might have trees do not sequester carbon evenly over their lifespans. Our forests are really similar in age here because we had widespread land clearing and then reforestation in kind of the late 1800s, early 1900s. Our forests are a lot of our forests are kind of in that age range of 100 years old. And so there's thought too that that might have something to do with it. But we need more diversity of age ranges and conditions across our forests to have a little bit more resiliency so we can maintain that carbon sequestration sink into the future.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Kasiba. Thank you, everybody. There's going to be a lot to talk about in these subcommittees, that's for sure. So we're a little past noon. We have the next item on our agenda, which is the organizational update, and I'm going to hand the reins over to Secretary Moore to go through those agenda items and lead any kind of discussion on those.
Great. Thank you very much, Secretary Young. I have a couple of updates to offer, and then just also willing to answer questions folks might have as we look to the next meeting. But specifically starting from the items listed on the agenda, and just trying to bring up my agenda at the same time to make sure I have the final one. The first one is just the update on staff recruitment. We have narrowed the extremely competitive field of applicants for the Global Warming Solutions Act project manager position to a set of 3 finalists, and we'll be conducting final interviews this week. Still believe we are on track to make an offer in time to have somebody on board by the end of the month, and are very much looking forward to getting this person in place. We've also begun the work of drafting the job description for the program technician position, and expect to post that one by mid-month, with the idea that the project manager will be actively involved in the hiring. We have recently completed a small contract with an outfit called CBI, the Consensus Building Institute. Some of you may be familiar with their work in that they supported the Payment for Ecosystem Services project that Ryan Patch described in his presentation, and have had other prior involvement in Vermont. They were also the firm that provided facilitation support services to the state of Maine as they work to develop their climate action plan. They have entered into a small contract with the agency specifically and limited to some pre-work and then support of the conversation we're going to have about process design at the meeting on the 25th. I anticipate that one or more folks from CBI will reach out to many of you over the next 3 weeks and gather some information that will hopefully facilitate and make stronger our work on the 25th. That said, the easiest way for them to reach you is going to be via phone, and I don't think we have a comprehensive listing of phone numbers currently. Melissa Maza-Paquette has sent me the list of the ones she has, but if you do not believe you have a phone number on file with the Agency of Administration at this point, it would be great if you could shoot it to Melissa in an email so that the folks from CBI could reach you. And just want to give you the names of the people from CBI that you're likely to hear from as part of this conversation. There are 3 different individuals that may be engaged in this work: Pat Field, David Plum, and Catherine Morris. So just so you know who you may hear from over the next few weeks. And then the final item on the list is the request for information for technical services. I just over the last week completed a complete draft of the RFI. My hope is still that this will go out mid-month. This is really focused on some of the technical elements and kind of the scenario building work that will ultimately be necessary to inform conversations about the different programs and strategies that go into the climate action plan. This is not related to drafting the climate action plan itself. That's work I'm envisioning will continue to be done by the council with the dedicated support of the Global Warming Solutions Act project manager. But if there's anyone on the line who has a particularized interest in the RFI, if you want to shoot me an email, I'm happy to find a time to walk you through it before that gets released. We are anticipating that will help us understand the cost of the analyses that need to be done. And then we will issue a full-blown RFP to actually secure contractor support. So maybe I'll pause there, and Secretary Young, if there's anything else you were hoping I could touch on, or happy to answer questions if folks have them.
I have nothing to add, Julie. I think you addressed all three items on the agenda, but certainly let's open it up to some discussion.
Question.
Sure.
Secretary Moore, I'm sorry if you noted this and I missed it. Tell me a little bit more about the agenda for the next meeting. And
Sure.
I have a question that's sort of tied to that, but maybe you'll answer it.
Okay. So the intention for the next meeting is twofold. One, the first part of the meeting will be a panel discussion with representatives from other jurisdictions that have recently undertaken and in many cases completed similar work to what's prescribed in Act 153. I have invited representatives from the states of Maine, Massachusetts, New York, as well as the U.S. Climate Alliance to be part of that panel. And my hope is that they can give us some lessons learned and thoughts about what pieces that they found were particularly successful, particularly challenging, et cetera. And then the bulk of the next meeting is going to be focused on process design and sort of the organizational structure for our work going forward. As Secretary Young's indicated previously, that we've booked meetings of the whole of the council once a month for each of the next 10 or 12 months. But there's the work of the subcommittees and how that work gets brought back together. And CBI will be leading us through a conversation about how we want to organize ourselves, conduct and complete that work, and the timeline in order to ensure we're consistent with the requirements of the Global Warming Solutions Act as they stand now, or I think building on some of the conversation had earlier today with Susanna about the schedule, if we need to be seeking changes to that schedule with the legislature.
And just thank you so much. That's very helpful. Just to follow up on that, I guess it's more of, and maybe this is part of that discussion at the next meeting, is just trying to understand better sort of the role of the council members based on the expertise that they bring that could, to sort of round out what we ask other consultants to bring. I mean, I feel like there's a lot of people who are appointed for specific roles and expertise, and it seems like understanding that, so we understand what we can pull from and what we can't, so that it informs what we ask of others with limited capacity, knowing there's limited time and limited capacity.
Yeah, no, I think that's an important part of the next meeting. I know Liz and others had suggested at one point sort of a skills matrix. I think that could be part of this conversation. I very much to the point you made, Joey. I think one of the greatest challenges is the schedule at this point, and whereas I know that there is significant expertise contained within the members of the council. I think the bigger question is what capacity people have to sort of donate their time to this effort over the next 10 to 12 months. The RFI is intended to assume that a lot of the technical work beyond what capacity there is within the state government and agency staff will need to be done by contractors, recognizing that may be able to be dialed back if people are able to make commitments. And the challenge there is it does need to be a commitment. If we're relying on people to do certain pieces of work, we have to be able to rely on them. And I think I feel that probably particularly acutely, since to the extent that the council doesn't produce an action plan, it ultimately falls to the agency to produce the action plan.
Thank you. Member Dominatric, please.
Hi, I'm just to tee up an issue in terms of our process conversation for the next meeting, the comprehensive energy plan schedule and the public involvement schedule associated with that I'm sure Commissioner Tierney is quite familiar with, happens simultaneously with our efforts, which poses both an opportunity and a challenge, I think, in terms of our engagement process.
Agreed and noted, and I will specifically ask CBI to talk with Commissioner Tierney or members of her staff to make sure that they are sort of fully read into the timeline for the comprehensive energy plan. Thank you.
Member Campany, please.
Hey, So consensus abilities we use them when we were structuring the operations of the Nuclear Decommissioning Systems Advisory Panel. And I can't remember if they recommended this or not, and this may be something but I just want to throw this out as something to have in the back of our minds. One of the things that the panel created was an issues advisory committee, and it was a subset of the larger panel that would get together and help develop kind of the roadmap of issues to be discussed by the panel, agendas for meetings, how those meetings will be structured. So that may be something that the council would want to look at. And again, CBI, I'm sure, is aware of it because of their engagement with the nuclear decommissioning panel. But that's that way it doesn't, the burden doesn't fall solely to the state agencies, and you wind up with a more kind of broader-based, inclusive engagement and setting setting the agendas to get the work of the council done. So, and they would also, the issues committee would also oftentimes kind of take a first crack at framing issues that need to be addressed. And like one of those that's come up today a few times now is the schedule of the work of the council, and do we actually need to take that back to the legislature to revisit it? So that would be, I'm just using that as an example of the kind of thing that like an issues committee could, as an advisory group, kind of take up to bring to the council for full deliberation. So just wanted to throw that out there. I'm happy to talk to anybody about how that's worked with the panel.
Thank you.
Great, and the last hand raised is by Member Oates. Oh, actually, we have two more. So Member Oates, please.
Thank you, Melissa. A lot of good points there, Chris. Just a couple of things I wanted to call to attention. I sent an email after our last meeting, but I know that it might have fallen victim to the email-induced hole that we're all kind of crawling out of now from the holidays. So a couple of points, especially on the time frame. I recommended, and I don't know the viability of this, but that we stand up, since we're using Teams as our meeting platform, a Teams channel or a Teams team through which the council members can communicate in between meetings. As we know, there's a lot of information that we have already been presented, and a lot of recommendations that we need to be considering and working through. And getting that all done potentially in bi-weekly or monthly meetings is not going to cut it by December. So hoping that there's some means by which we can have an online forum for us to be communicating and sharing resources between meetings. The second is a recommendation that I think was called to attention earlier by Susanna about public inclusion in this process and the ability of ADS, or the Agency of Digital Services, to create a public comment portal on the Vermont Climate Council page on the AOA website, just so that we're already running up in the public comment now, and just recommending that we create a place where people can, if they can't participate in this meeting or future meetings, that they have a place that they can be dropping their good ideas or thoughts. And on that, a request again I made on that email that we follow the public meeting style that school boards across the state are using, that the legislature is using, where we use more of a webinar format so that council members can more easily communicate with each other during meetings, and that the public comment through chat function is also held until the end of the meeting, so that we can make sure that we understand who's talking to whom. And that's, again, the process through which the legislature, school boards, and a couple of other public boards are following now. And then last question or comment is just calling attention to the January 15th deadline for a report to the General Assembly by the council, and recognizing this is our last convening before that. I guess just wondering what's going into that report, what oversight or involvement from council members is necessary at this point, so that we know what we're actually saying to the council or to the legislature in a few weeks here. And that was a lot, but that was everything I have in a couple of minutes.
Thank you, Lauren. That is a lot, and we're not going to be able to address all of that today. I do appreciate the idea about a Teams site. We do use Teams. It is the venue of choice for the state because of security concerns. So unfortunately, we do not have the ability to live stream, as do the legislative committees and school boards. And even if we did, we would be inviting the public into the meetings because it is a public meeting. And the public comments are, if folks from the public are posting in the chat, those you do not have to read right away. If they're distracting, to your focus on the meeting, you could turn off the chat function while we do presentations and the like. They will always be there for you to see in the Teams meeting if you log back into it, so you won't lose the benefit of the public comments. So there's one thing in the short term while we figure out if there is a way for us to do as you suggest, which is have a place for members to meet in between meetings. But I guess I would caution, and I would want to talk with council about when that crosses the line into an unwarned meeting of the body. As you may recall from the AG's office, that gets a little bit tricky with emails and the like that can be construed as meetings. So we really do have to be sure we're honoring the open meetings law and the transparency that's required of a group of this sort, which is not advisory, unlike other groups you may have served on. This is a policy-making committee that does have to meet in public and be transparent about its work. As far as the report, I mean, Secretary Moore and I discussed it briefly. We've done, we will report what we've done to date, which is to lay the foundational work and what we plan to do on the 25th. And we certainly could make a draft available for anybody who would like to comment on it before we send it out. It will likely be brief and linked to most of the presentations we've had. And if there's more to it, that you would like to suggest adding once we circulate it, we're certainly happy to put one out, a draft out for comment. I'm not sure I unpacked everything there, but I'm sure that will be part of our facilitated meeting, as well as how we're going to operate and work as a whole and as a group of subcommittees.
Thank you. And we have one more hand raised by member Dupany-Giroux, please.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to piggyback on all of the comments that were just made, especially by Chris and Lauren. And I feel that we're at a point where we need to sort of just maybe take a step back and consider the big picture as we move forward in terms of not just the moving pieces of what we need to accomplish, but also making sure that everybody who is or is not or should be at the table is at the table in whatever shape or form that we can facilitate that and provide that, so that we do the best possible creation of what we're doing as we can by not leaving out anybody. And I think to go back to a lot of the things that Susanna brought to us in uncovering the ways of thinking about that, in uncovering the ways that we make sure that all voices are heard, all sectors are being represented. If maybe part of the next meeting we can sort of carve out part of that time to do that strategic thinking, to do that strategic engagement, to maybe go back to some of the things that Ali Kosiba talked about. If you have 80% of the lands being privately owned, how do we make sure that we're engaging with folks who could be part of what we create as a policy? And how do you bring that into the conversation now and not at the very end? So I think if there's a way of sort of like rethinking or envisioning how we do some of this big picture wise, that would sort of help us with the subcommittee pieces and all those other pieces kind of moving from then on.
Yes, thank you for that. And I see Secretary Moore taking notes, which I assume, I mean, that really is captures, some of what we hope to be able to do with the facilitator and the conversation with other states who've already maybe about a year ahead of us and lessons learned and how to do it even better than they did. So I appreciate that. Okay.
Member Clark has her hand raised, please.
Can you hear me?
We can, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I just kind of reflecting on this whole discussion, and from what I'm taking away is that, you know, there's an urgency to A, be taking action, and B, to be including all these different voices and backgrounds and just bodies of people and land. And I'm just putting it out there that I think we should really all just come together on some consensus and really, like, there's so much work being done, but at the same time, I feel like there's so many great presentations, of course, but that there's not a lot of discussion around, like, okay, what implementations can we be making? What things can we be discussing together as a community, as a network? And I don't know. Like, as a youth member, I'm just sitting here and I'm like, maybe we're not arguing, but it feels like we're kind of like just going back and forth on how to create these meetings and whatnot, but Mother Nature doesn't have time for that. And we're just going to continue to keep seeing data that's saying we need to change things around. And I don't know. I just think we should really prioritize just meeting in a just formal manner, obviously not in person, but just getting to the point, talking about ways to change things, just all this. Sorry for my ranting. I just really hope to see, like, I don't know, like, more action, even though there's like already a ton of action. We just all need to collectively bring ourselves. That's all I have to say. But thank you, everyone. Yeah, happy to be here.
Thank you, Sophie. And I understand the urgency and somewhat, the desire to get going. And, we felt it from the executive branch, felt it was really important for everybody to have the same base level of understanding of what we've done as a state. And then the statute does require us to, create these inventories. And we hope that we've done that with some success over the last couple of meetings, and that everyone's got the same baseline of information anyway. There are some in this group that are just absolute experts on certain topics, and others of us who are absolute neophytes. So I hope that we were successful in at least drawing attention for all of you to the work that's ongoing and the inventory of work that's going on. And again, with a facilitated meeting next week, it's our hope and desire that, we will have the conversation, Sophie, that a conversation about how to have the conversations that you're anxious to have. So, we will work, towards how to best do this work through the subcommittee structure that the legislature has given us, and maybe there are some other good ideas we'll learn from those who've gone before us. So thank you all. Yes, Hannah?
Sorry, a couple of quick things. So related to the report to the legislature, thank you. I would love to see just a draft of whatever you put together. And it's like, I guess one other thing that I am thinking about is that it's come up a couple of times about whether or not we should potentially encourage the legislature to push back the deadline. I mean, I feel that tension about the sort of urgency and, and like there's a lot to do in a short amount of time, and, the need for good public process. I am deeply committed to that as well. So I look forward to doing that. I would also say that, the deadlines were set based on the science and we're already way behind. So I guess I would say, I don't know what that conversation looks like as a council to sort of advocate for pushing back the deadline. I would have deep concerns about that just because we've had these goals on the books for almost 15 years or about 15 years. So I just want to raise that and encourage us to just put our heads down, like Sophia said, and do the work. We have a tremendous amount to build from, and at the risk of being a broken record and not wanting to be talked at, but to get to the conversations, just one last time saying that Jerry Duvall, the work of the Energy Action Network, is a really important encapsulating, sort of easy to wrap your head around, like where we stand. So one more push for asking Jared in his role as the expert in data analysis, informed by really good state work in partnership with EAN, to maybe present at the next meeting. Sorry, I know I'm cutting into public comment time, but
no, that's okay. I mean, I think it's something too that maybe, as we got to get into these subcommittees and roll up our sleeves, and maybe that's the appropriate place. But why don't we, this could certainly be something if we want to talk, the next meeting about what those subcommittees look like, and where's the expertise in this group and the time in this group to put into the subcommittee work. So definitely we'll consider that. So we are running into the public comment time, and I think I'll ask Melissa if we could slide into that, and if anyone signed up ahead of time to give public comment. And for those of you members of the public who are in this meeting, if you could raise your hands if you would like to comment, and then we can try to divvy up the time that we have available.
Thank you. We'll start with Matt Cota, please.
Yes, hi, thank you. Great deep dive this morning, important discussion. I know far more about forest lands and soil and the impact on our environment. I think that was very helpful. At a future meeting, I would offer my assistance in how we could do a deep dive into how liquid fuels are sold in Vermont, how much is sold, who sells it, who uses it. We use about 600 million gallons in Vermont every year, and I'm happy to provide that expertise. Vermont Fuel is a nonprofit trade group that tracks this data and can pull together a presentation fairly quickly. As the Climate Council seeks to virtually eliminate this fuel in the state, I think it's important that there be a public examination on how it's used, where it comes from, and who sells it. I can also put together a team that can provide details on the net zero pathway for the oil heat industry and biodiesel and renewable diesel success stories in meeting low carbon fuel standards in other states. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Carl Bayer, please. Carl, would you please unmute so we can hear you? Carl, you're on mute.
I apologize.
Thank you.
My name is Carl Bayer from Rygate. I'm on the Energy Committee in Rygate. I didn't have a comment. I had a question during Jan Spilke's presentation. I had gotten some information from the Valley Journal, I think it was, about the new rules on use of federal lands for logging, and some concerns about it, both in terms of process of involving the public and whether or not there should be logging in public lands, in the federal public lands. So my question, when I heard the presentation about our forests, our needs of our forests to mitigate climate change from Hans, I was thinking, well, there's an opportunity for old growth forests in the public lands, and we have some of them in the. Somebody said we had 8% in the federal land. So my question is, what is the state's position on the new rules about the use of logging in the federal lands? What's our position, and what have we been communicating with the federal government about the new rules? And also, how do these rules that the federal government now have on their public lands, are they lined up with our own plans about the use of the forests in Vermont, which I think would be the really critical thing, the important thing, that actually what they do lines up with our plans. So those are my questions. Thank you.
So I'm going to defer to Secretary Moore here to advise who in state government, I'm assuming someone in your agency, will be the subject matter expert on this, that Mr. Bayer could perhaps get some answers from.
Yeah, if you wanted to drop your email address into the chat, I can have somebody follow up with you. and from our Department of Forest, Parks and Recreation. I think the challenge you've noted is real in that we don't have a lot of say or sway in how the federal government chooses to manage their lands, particularly in response to requirements and decrees that come from leadership within those agencies. But we can certainly follow up and provide you with some additional information.
Thank you.
Robert Leimert, please.
Yes, I wanted to point out to Matt Cota in particular the existence of a 12 state partnership having to do, it's a partnership that was Mid-Atlantic Sustainable Biomass for Value-Added Products Consortium, also known as Mass Bio. It's funded by the USDA and NIFA, and it is specializing in developing. Well, it's specializing in reforestation and afforestation to develop biodiesel types of, well, biofuels in general. They can actually make gasoline, but this is something that I think you need to take a look at. Many owners of heavy construction equipment, large trucks, and farm equipment are concerned that vehicles that rely on liquid fuels are going to be left in the cold. And I share that, and certainly we're not the only people that are concerned with that. And Matt, if you wanted to reach out to me via LinkedIn, I'll provide you links that'll describe this in detail, and would also commend this to the committee in that we have so many other states that are participating in this, but Vermont is not.
Thank you very much, Mr. Leimert, for that information, and I'm sure there will be folks here who will be interested in linking to that. Melissa, I see no further hands raised. Is there anybody? Okay, any member of the public who does not have the hand raising function that wants to speak, you should probably speak now and we will pick up your voice and be able to call on you. Hearing nobody, thank you all for members of the public for attending and commenting for those who did. And I think we're moving now to our final agenda item, which is adjournment. It's 12:34 and I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
There a second?
Second.
All in favor of adjournment, please say aye.
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 All opposed? All right. Well, thank you very much. And we really look forward to the meeting on the 25th as a real transition meeting into the nuts and bolts work we have ahead of us, and appreciate everybody being here today. And again, Happy New Year, and we'll see you at the end of the month.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.